You
trial to
had
try
talked
and
a little bit in the beginning about the health risks that Julian faces, and everyone knows the fact that COVID-19 is now rampant inside of Belmarsh prison. I believe Glenn Greenwald said yesterday that there has been at least a few deaths inside of Belmarsh from COVID-19. Could you talk a little bit though about the pre-existing health conditions that Julian had going into this situation, as
Mm.
well as how the continued solitary confinement and detention has affected that?
Yeah, and that's really important. Well, there's a few grounds on which Julian is medically vulnerable to COVID-19. So one is persistent respiratory issues. He's had a number of lung infections, and that does happen to people in prisons and in solitary. It's something you read about. So that obviously anybody with lung conditions and respiratory issues is more vulnerable to COVID-19. After a decade of psychological torture, he would have seriously compromised immunity. There's a lot of literature on this chronic psychological stress, and he's been under extreme, relentless psychological stress and trauma and threat and danger. And helplessness particularly feeds into this. Immunity is suppressed. Immune cells physically self-destruct. The body stops producing immune cells. Communication between immune cells is disrupted. And that manifests differently in different people. Just like we all under stress, someone might get a headache, someone else might get a rash. That chronic psychological stress and the suppressed immunity can manifest in all kinds of ways, which is what the doctors have been warning about. It can cause cancer. It can cause cardiovascular failure. It can cause atypical infections. So even without COVID-19, that suppressed immunity means that just a normal infection could kill Julian Assange or anyone subjected to that level of extreme chronic stress. And here we have COVID-19. It's really lethal to vulnerable people. So that's very dangerous. And it's precisely the kind of non-trivial illness that doctors have been warning about going back years in Julian Assange's case. And then he has a number of conditions that have been untreated. Back in, I think it was 2015, doctors said, look, he needs an MRI. He needs possibly, quite complex surgery that has to be done in a hospital, not an embassy, not a prison medical board. He's never had that MRI. He's had exposed dental pulp, and, extremely painful. That required hospital treatment, which he hasn't received. And instead, what's happened, so anyway, they're the things that make him vulnerable to COVID-19. He's untreated recurrent infections, the immunosuppression of chronic psychological torture, and a lung condition. So it's urgent that he's released from Belmarsh Prison on bail. And really shocking that the emergency bail request was denied. Was it on the 25th of March? The court heard evidence of at least the respiratory issues, and all of the other medical issues are on the record, public record. So he's really being left in harm's way. He's being put in harm's way in front of a lethal virus, and also keeping him in there on bail flies in the face of an international human rights consensus on prisoner release in light of COVID-19. And there's been quite a few reports, and essentially prisons act as what they call epidemiological pumps, where the virus, experiences explosive transmission inside the prison, and then everyone who comes and goes from the prison spreads it. I think in some US states, almost 4 out of 10 of COVID cases can be traced back to prisons. So for that reason, for the health of the prisoners, because they can't practice physical distancing and the hygiene isn't what you need to prevent transmission. There's international bodies have issued guidelines. The World Health Organization and the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights have issued some guidelines about prisoner release under COVID-19. And Julian Assange meets all the criteria. He's unsentenced, he's unconvicted, he's being held without sufficient legal basis under international law, which is one of the criteria. Anybody detained for publishing activity, they said, should be released. And they said that anybody being arbitrarily detained should be released. And the world's authority on arbitrary detention has found that Julian Assange is being arbitrarily detained. So, there's absolutely no justification for not granting him emergency bail. He meets every single internationally agreed criteria. So